Well, just to introduce myself, I'm Fred Weston. I'm on the editorial board of the In Defense of Marxism website, which is the website, the International Marxist Tendency, which is an international Marxist grouping with comrades all over the world struggling within the left and the Labour movement for Marxist ideas. I'm a Marxist, and I'm not ashamed of it. And I'll put forward a point of view which I believe is a Marxist analysis. My connection to Greece is I'm not Greek at all, but I have been to Greece practically every year since 1998, attending meetings, discussing with comrades, and following the situation. And I've written several articles on the situation. Now, the Greek situation is dramatic, as you can all see from the recent weeks. The economic and social situation in Greece is an absolute catastrophe for the Greek people. If you think unemployment stands at about 25%, youth unemployment is over 50%. The economy, since the crisis began, not the Greek crisis, but the international crisis of capitalism, which began in 2008, with the banking crisis. Since that crisis, GDP in Greece has shrunk by 25%. That means Greece is producing a quarter less than what it was producing. That explains the unemployment. It explains the poverty. Anecdotal evidence of the conditions. I went to Greece, and I was told people are burning all kinds of wood in stoves because they can't afford to pay for the electricity or the gas, and you can smell it in the air. That's a real material. You can touch the crisis in that, but also stories about children fainting in classes because they're not eating enough. 40% of the population is living in very difficult conditions. It's a humanitarian crisis, as the leaders of Syriza have clearly expressed. And the debt of Greece is 320 billion euros, which is the equivalent of 175% of GDP. Greece owes almost twice what it produces in a year. That means that de facto the Greek debt is unpayable. The tension and the conflict of the last few weeks, what lies behind it is the fact that this debt cannot really be paid off. There's no way you can pay this debt off, and even if you starve the Greeks for 2 years, you wouldn't be able to pay it off. But capitalists who lend money don't like to hear that. I've lent the money, I want my money back, or at least I want the interest on the money. It's capital, it's an asset, which I have. Now, since they applied the policies in Greece which were imposed on Greece by the Troika, that's the European Central Bank, the European Commission, and the IMF, the debt has gone from 125% ratio to GDP to 175%. So, in spite of all the cuts, all the suffering, and the payments which Greece has made to the lenders, the debt, instead of going down, has gone up. As Varoufakis said, the finance minister, austerity in Greece has failed. It has clearly failed. Now, why that is the case and what the solution, that is something that has to be discussed. Now, Greece borrowed something like 240 billion euros from the European Union, the ECB and the IMF. The borrowing of that money came with strings attached, like any borrowing, in terms of payment, but not just in terms of the repayments, also in terms of what policies the Greek government must apply. And those policies are the same policies they're imposing on Europe as a whole, the same policies they've imposed on Spain, on Portugal, on Italy, and other countries. Austerity is being applied to one degree or another across Europe. Obviously, in Greece, it's much more severe because of the level of debt. But it's the same policy. You will see what the next British government will have to do. And on that, the question of elections and what are elections in in a bourgeois democracy. You see, the Greek people voted for a party that stood on the Thessaloniki programme. Now that programme, I'll list some of the contents of it, is to increase public spending, gradually reverse all the memorandum injustices, rebuild the welfare state, write off a large part of the public debt's nominal value, stop privatisation of public assets, gradually restore the salaries and pensions, free electricity and meal subsidies for the 300,000 poorest families, a partial write-off of debt incurred by people who are now under the poverty line, suspension of foreclosures on prime. The list is endless, and the restoration of the minimum wage to 751 euros. Now, that's the programme the party stood on, and that's the programme the people voted for. Now, if we look at that programme, I would say it's probably the most left-wing programme we've seen in a European election for many, many years. A genuine reformist programme. Let's put it like, in the sense that there's reforms. You know, today the reformists don't even propose reforms. You know, the Miliband type of reformist is actually proposing cutting and destroying what has been achieved in the past. Here we have a party which stands on a clear programme and wins the elections. The point that I made in an article I wrote is that you know, Miliband in Britain would say that if we stood on this programme in Britain, we'd lose votes. Well, there's an opinion poll of a few days ago in Austria, which is not the worst case scenario in Europe, it's one of the better ones in terms of conditions and jobs and the economy. They asked in an opinion poll, would you be prepared to vote for a party like Syriza if it existed in Austria? 25% said yes, in Austria. Now, that shows you something about the impact of Syriza on a European level. In Spain, we have a party that's called Podemos, which is a new party. And its point of reference, in a certain sense, is the experience of Greece with Syriza. They look to the experience of Greece in a kind of hope and expectation that here we have the chance to show that a people, a nation, can stand up and say no to austerity and succeed in stopping basically international finance capital from strangling the Greek people. And the party, the Podemos party in Greece, in Spain, sorry, just over a year ago didn't exist. It was just about an idea in the heads of a few individuals. Pablo Iglesias, an ex-Izquierda Unida activist, and now has 200, I think it's gone up to maybe 300,000 members in a very short period of time, and it has the potential to actually win the elections. Now, I raise this because it's an important element in understanding the approach of Germany in particular, but the European Commission and European finance capital, in relation to Greece. Because if you look at Greece, in terms of its GDP, I think it's like 2% of the Eurozone. It's a very small part of the European economy. So you might think that it's so small, well, they could afford to write off the debt and they could afford to loosen up on the austerity. But it's not that simple. There's a political element involved. Because it's not just Greece. Greece is simply an anticipation of what we're going to see in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy, and later it's going to be France, and later it's going to be Britain. Because that's where we're all going in the same direction. And the opinion polls in Austria indicates that even Austria is going to be facing a similar kind of situation. The problem they've got is they've imposed austerity across Europe, and there's a limit to how much the working people and the poor can take. And in Greece, that limit was reached long ago. That explains the 30 general strikes since 2008. 24-hour general strikes, 48-hour general strikes, some more powerful than others, but a whole series of mobilizations, and the massive protests in Syntagma Square, if you remember. Huge numbers of people coming out. And what happened was, you clearly had the idea, we can stop these people by fighting and coming out. And they didn't. The austerity continued. The cuts continued. The suffering continued. And eventually, like all situations like this, from an attempt to fight, let's put it this way, on a trade union front, on a social front, fighting on the streets and protesting, people looked for a political way out. They drew a correct conclusion. It's not enough to to have a general strike. It's not enough even to bring out millions of people on the street. You have to change the politics. And so they swept away the old government and elected in Syriza. Let's not forget that Syriza, previously in the form of Synaspismos, only a few years ago was a small party of 4%. And it has become the main party on the left of Greece. And we have to say, how did it become that party? It became that party by announcing itself as the party which would cancel the debt or remove a large part of that debt and introduce all these reforms which I've listed. That's what the people voted for. But here's the essence of bourgeois democracy. Martin Schulz, the president of the European Parliament, visiting Greece, said, Syriza must realize that it is now the Greek government, not a party running an election campaign. And then he added that he was expecting Syriza to replace its election campaign rhetoric with pragmatic solutions which can work for both sides. So there we have it. You can have an election campaign, you can promise whatever you want to the people, but once you're elected, you have to forget what you said in the election campaign. You've got to become serious, you've got to become statesmanlike and responsible, and understand that the programme that you have to carry out was not decided in your party congress or in your central committee. It was decided by the European Central Bank, by the European Commission and the IMF, and European finance capital. And in Britain, you read the serious press. They say that this government has carried out 40% of what had to be cut. The next parliament must carry out the remaining 60%. What that means is, in Britain, you vote Tory, you vote Liberal, or you vote Labour, whatever government coalition or that, the programme has been decided elsewhere by finance capital, which is, you've got to pay your debts, therefore you've got to cut public spending, which means cuts in pensions, increases in VAT, etc., and cuts in government jobs, education, healthcare, etc. That is the programme that they are imposing on Europe. Now, the hope across Europe, I've spoken to people in different countries in the last few days, and you can see the mood is, people, especially people on the left, but also ordinary working people, the hope that Tsipras and Syriza could show Europe that there's another road, there's a way of guaranteeing the programme that they proposed within the European Union, because that is what has been attempted. But we see that particularly Germany, the German capitalists, have put their foot down very hard. If you see the hard position they adopted throughout all the negotiations, there was a point where the European Commission in Brussels was leaning towards some kind of compromise with Syriza, and Berlin came down very hard on Brussels. And that is because any problem with the European Central Bank, and it's Germany that has to pay. Now, I haven't got time here because there's so much to deal with, but I've read carefully the Confessions of an Erratic Marxist, which has made the rounds of the media lately, which is a speech that Varoufakis gave a couple of years ago at a conference on these questions. And he quotes another document, which is this. It's called A Modest Proposal, written together with Stuart Holland, who's an ex-Labour MP, and James Galbraith. Again, not enough time here to go into it, but the fundamental idea in here is that it's possible to find another policy within the Euro and the European Union without changing any of the treaties or laws of Europe or whatever, looking for a mechanism. And basically, I mean, the essence of it, I mean, I can't do justice to it in a few minutes, but the essence of it, if you look at it, is that a large part of the debt of every European Union member should be transferred to the European Central Bank. The Maastricht Treaty established that no European EU member state should have a deficit, that is, an overall debt, more than 60% of GDP. Well, Britain has 90%, Italy has 130%. I don't think there's anybody that's actually stuck to that criteria. And the idea was, well, that 60%, which is the legitimate debt, In the case of Greece, that would mean you take, of the 175%, you take 60 and you give it to the European Central Bank. So basically you hand over a third. But how? Well, they buy the bonds, they buy the debt, and then they complain that the Germans are not too keen on this. And again, he complains in his other documents, not too keen on this. Well, it's obvious they're not too keen because they're the main contributor. They're not the only contributor, but they would be the country which would have to take the bulk of the burden of any major default on a European scale. So they're opposed. But what I found interesting in Varoufakis is basically his confessions. He talks about the radicals in a terrible dilemma, and I quote, he says, "Should we use this once-in-a-century capitalist crisis as an opportunity to campaign for the dismantling of the European Union, given the latter's enthusiastic acquiescence to the neoliberal policies and creed? Or should we accept that the left is not ready for radical change and campaign instead for stabilising European capitalism?" He says, this paper argues that however unappetizing the latter proposition may sound in the ears of a radical thinker, it is the left's historical duty at this particular juncture to stabilise capitalism, to save capitalism from itself. Now, I could read on and on and on. What the essence of Varoufakis' thinking here is this. The left is being defeated. He refers to Thatcherism and all the past, which is true. There have been defeats in the past. The left is therefore not ready. It's not ready. It doesn't have an alternative. It doesn't have a worked out, coherent alternative to the policies that they're trying to impose on us. And he says, I would love to be able to present a radical socialist policy, but can't do that. And therefore, he talks about buying time and space in which to develop a genuinely humanist alternative. And he basically says that if the European Union and the Euro were to collapse, because the left hasn't got an alternative, that collapse would be barbaric. And it would lead to the rise of very reactionary forces, and he's referring obviously to the Nazis of the Golden Dawn and other similar forces. Now, I would say Marx raised the idea that the historical crisis of capitalism prepares two possible perspectives. One is socialism, the other is barbarism. Now, they're on an equal footing. I see in Varoufakis' writing that he only sees the barbarism. He can't see the socialism because, fundamentally, thinks that the working class at this stage is incapable and is not in a position to offer the alternative, and therefore to avoid the barbarism, we have to prop up capitalism somehow, i.e. restabilise the system, to have some kind of civilised existence, and that would give us time to develop an alternative. I think that's a bit of a bizarre way of thinking, because let's put it this way. Let's say it were possible. The policies of Varoufakis, he convinces the European Central Bank and the European Union to apply these policies, and somehow they find a solution within capitalism which allows for a prolonged period of boom like the post-war period, which would allow to have jobs, pensions, etc. Think about it. If it was theoretically possible for capitalism to achieve that today, once achieved, why would the workers want to fight that system if it's giving them decent wages, pensions and school, like it did after the Second World War? Along comes Comrade Varoufakis and the others who say, well, right, we've saved the system, we have a civilised existence, now for the next 10 or 20 years we'll develop an alternative. Once we've developed it, we'll present it to the workers. But why should they listen if capitalism is working? Marxism actually is based on the idea that capitalism, we understand that capitalism, when it goes through a prolonged period of boom, like the post-war period, brings with it political consequences, such as the idea that you do not have to radically transform capitalism, you don't have to overthrow it, you can achieve reforms, and you can gradually change and better the conditions of workers on the basis of capitalism itself. And that idea is strengthened by the fact that for 20 or 30 years after the Second World War, capitalism was booming. There was free education, there was healthcare, at least in most of European countries. But now the system is in a crisis. It's in a deep crisis, out of which they are finding it very difficult to climb. And I would argue that if that idea were possible, I think that the capitalists would listen. They would say to Comrade Varoufakis, you're right. Yes. We should stop the austerity, and we should basically apply fundamentally a Keynesian policy. In his text he says that we should take some of Keynes and add it to Marx, and then that would work. The fact is, though, that capitalism doesn't work according to that logic. Capitalism functions according to the logic of profit making, and it's what makes a profit which convinces the capitalists to act. Now, there's another problem. One of the demands that the Greek government posed in the negotiations was that the repayment of debt should be linked to Greeks' ability to pay. Now, that seems perfectly reasonable. Like any worker, if I've got a job, I can pay my mortgage. If I haven't got a job, I can't pay my mortgage. It's a fact that they're under capitalism. If you haven't got a job and can't pay your mortgage, you lose your house, because the lender says, I'm sorry, I want my capital back, and I'm going to have to take your house and sell it. You could say to the bank manager, no, when I get a job, I'll start paying. In the meantime, I'll stay in my house. It just doesn't work under capitalism. It would be a good idea if we could apply it, and we would fully support such an idea, but the question is how. Now, if we look at what happened since the elections, in the immediate period after the elections, Syriza representatives went to Brussels and negotiated with what seemed quite a hard, determined position. Tsipras made speeches, we're never going to give in, we're not the sovereignty, we're not going to be told by these people. And in the opinion polls, the popularity ratings of Tsipras went over 70%. And there's an opinion poll here, it's in Greek, said that if they had voted, say last week, Syriza would have received 45-46%. That would have meant, in the present conditions, a landslide majority in Parliament. It might have been an idea for Tsipras to force a crisis and call early elections. Then you could have said to the European, you say the Greek people, they're treating the Greek people as if they're stupid, first of all, and secondly, ignoring their opinion. That would have sent a very powerful message. But the reason for this massive increase in the opinion polls was the firm stance they were taking towards the European Union. Again, it confirms that a militant left position actually wins popular support. It proves the opposite of what the reformists have been saying, that if you move too far to the left, if you move too far away from the centre ground, you will lose support. One opinion poll actually showed that 91% of the Golden Dawn electorate supported Tsipras' stance vis-à-vis the European Union. Now, Varoufakis, one of his concerns, and it's a genuine concern, is that the present crisis, if it goes to a collapse of the system, unless the left, if we say the left doesn't offer an alternative, then you can have the rise of the right wing. That's true. History shows that. But this opinion poll shows there's a contradiction here. What it shows is that if they'd taken on the European Union fully, they would have probably sucked away a significant layer of people who vote in for the Golden Dawn, who could vote to the left. The same is true of New Democracy. New Democracy's in the opinion polls was down to 18%. The PASOK, I think, disappears from Parliament, according to this opinion poll, if they'd have elected, because it's below 3%. What it shows is this massive swing to the left beyond the elections. It didn't stop at the elections, the swing to the left. It continued. Now, we have seen in the recent period protests in Syntagma Square of people supporting the government. When was the last time you saw people on the streets supporting their own government? It's a while since we saw. Imagine in Britain, people on the streets supporting Cameron and Clegg. They removed the barriers from outside the Parliament, because before they had to have barriers because the protests would have charged into the Parliament if they'd had a chance. They removed them because there was no danger of that, because the people were in sympathy with the government and supporting it. And that also explains situations such as Varoufakis and Dragasakis in Brussels seeming to agree to a proposal, unclear as well the content. Financial Times says one thing, the government says another. Varoufakis phones Tsipras and they say, no way. Well, there were 30,000 people on the streets in Syntagma Square outside the Parliament. That may have been an argument in favour of saying, so we cannot sign this. The people don't want this. In a sense, the Greek people became a protagonist in the political situation. Normally, the politics is between the parties and the politicians. Here you have the Greek people actively involved as a force to be reckoned with, and they forced. That explains the tense sort of knife-edge negotiations all the way along. But the problem is this: Greece is a capitalist country and remains so, even though there's a Syriza government. The wealth is not in the hands of working people; it's in the hands of the shipbuilders and the oligarchs. Since December, 20 billion euros have been taken out of the Greek banks. Friday of last week, 1 billion euros was taken out of the Greek banks. And in the previous week or two, 200 to 300 million euros a day were being taken out, posing a situation where the Greek banks could have collapsed. The European Central Bank, 2 weeks ago, gave over 5 billion funding to the Greek banks. The week later, a further 3.8 billion, I think it was. It sounds a lot, but 3.8 is enough to guarantee the liquidity of the Greek banks for 5 days. So the total that the Greek banks have received through this funding is nearly 70 billion euros. Now, there you see who you know, when you hold a knife, you can hold the blade or you can hold the handle. It's clearly, we know who has the handle. The European Central Bank was holding the handle there, and basically the threat is there. You don't come to a deal, your banks can just collapse tomorrow. Now they're boasting about the fact that they restructured the debt. Only 46 billion of all this debt apparently is in the hands of private banks. The rest is in the hands of state institutions and European institutions. The idea being, if Greece collapses, it won't create a massive wave of bank collapses. Yeah, but the people who lent the money essentially still would suffer. Greece still has to pay its bills. It has to pay the government workers. It has to pay its pensions. It has to pay for healthcare, etc. And it has this huge deficit. The state doesn't have this money. Furthermore, the latest figures show that in January there was a 23% drop in tax revenues. Something like close to 1 billion euros lost. Now, one of the things that they've committed themselves to, and that's one of the few things that the European Central Bank and the others agree to, is tax evasion. We've got to tackle tax evasion. We would all agree. The shipbuilders, I think, pay less tax than anybody else in Greece. I mean, they must be those that get the cheapest level of taxes in Europe. And they stash their money away safely outside of Greece. Now, the question is, how are they going to solve this crisis? In the end, the truth of the matter is that the Greek government was forced to step back from most of its demand. I would say 90%, if not more. If you look at the different things they've given into, there's a headline here, interesting one from the BBC, and the headline is, Syriza dumps Marx for Blair. This is Robert Peston from the BBC. It says, Syriza appears to have transformed itself from what in the UK would be seen as traditional leftists into Blairites. He says, vanished are the party's seeming implacable hostility to privatisation. And in fact, if you look at the agreement, if you look at the actual content of the agreement, all the privatisations that are in process will be maintained, and even future privatisations, it's no longer absolutely no, it's we will look at each one according to law and get the best deal, terms, etc. It's not an absolute no. That poses a problem to Comrade Lafazanis, who's on the left of the party, who's come out determinedly against privatisations. This opens the door to the possibility of that not being the case. And it's also worded in terms of promoting competition, etc., etc. Now, this is what has happened. It's a climb down under the pressure of the European institutions. I'd argue also that there's a bit of playing with words, because, for example, the Troika
which was something which was said in the election campaign, out. The Troika is out, the memorandum is finished. Varoufakis was interviewed recently, and he says that the Troika is out, we negotiate individually with the different institutions, that is the ECB, the EC, the IMF, and now the wording is with the institutions. And everything they've agreed to, there's also the ambiguity of the agreement, is it has to be within the fiscal constraints, it has to be within the overall budget. On Friday of last week, Tsipras had announced he was going to pass a law to introduce the minimum wage and other measures, and Schäuble and the others, they said, no way, you do that, and that's the negotiations are finished, and they didn't. They didn't introduce the changes. Now, he says, these are the words of Varoufakis, he says, we have also committed towards our partners, strange, this is like the partnership of the horse and the rider, you know, and the rider has the whip, and the Greeks are clearly the horse and the Germans are the rider. He says, towards our partners, that we will not take any unilateral actions that might have, as a result, the encumbrance of the budget, the financial instability, or any kind of negative results in the possibilities of economic recovery. And there's others. He says, you see the language. They asked me to stop talking about the cancellation of the debt, but talk instead of its restructuring. He says, the restructuring of the debt is exactly that, a debt reduction. So it's like, what is it exactly? There was actually in one bourgeois paper I read on this, I don't know if it was Financial Times or the BBC reporting, that said, we've got to find a way of presenting a deal which to the Europeans is presented as a continuation of the memoranda, and to the Greeks as a bridging loan. And I'm thinking, well, you know, people aren't stupid. They don't live on separate planets that don't communicate. It would be obvious what is being done, and that is what is being done. And then he actually says, I find this quite curious, he said, we would have liked to put the word moratorium in it, but you know, and then he says, creative ambiguity in such documents is very important. Creative ambiguity. And then he refers to it again when he's referring to, if you read our text, you will see a creative ambiguity in it. What does that mean, creative ambiguity? Ambiguity, in my way of thinking, means that it has two possible meanings, but only one of them can apply. You can be ambiguous. When a person is being ambiguous, what are they trying to do? They're trying to avoid saying exactly what is, because they feel different pressures and equal pressures. And one of them is this powerful pressure from the European Commission, Central Bank, etc., and this equally powerful pressure from the Greek people that voted for something else. Now the problem is this. The Thessaloniki program is something that we as Marxists would fully support, and we support it completely. But you have to be serious when you pose a program like that. You have to say, where is the money going to come from? If you pose the question of cancelling a significant part of the debt, you are de facto breaking with the European Union. But at the same time you say, no. Tsipras wrote an article in the Financial Times shortly before the elections saying that we will respect our commitments. He repeated it after the elections. We will respect our payments. We will pay on time, etc., etc. And the question is this. If you are going to pay on time and respect your commitments, how are you going to carry out the Thessaloniki program? How are you going to pay for the free electricity? How are you going to pay for the minimum? How are you going to make sure the minimum wage, because it will apply to the private sector but also to the public sector, taking on these government workers which have been made redundant in the previous period? And what we argued, and what our companies in Syriza have been arguing is fully apply the program. We were elected on this program, apply it. But the question is, how do you finance it? And the only way you can finance it, and we have to be honest, and Lenin used to say the truth is revolutionary. And what we should say is the truth to the Greek people. This is the program you voted for. We've tried to apply this program in negotiations with these people. You see how they've treated us. You see how they've refused any real compromise. They talk about a compromise. You look at the stock market. The stock market after the last agreement, shot up again in Britain. Record levels. And one of the reasons was the agreement in Greece. What it means when the stock market goes up like that, it indicates confidence of the capitalists who invest the money that the policies that are being applied are going to be profitable policies for the investors, which means it's not going to be good for working people. Now in Greece, the question is this: the wealth is there. It's a false idea that we don't have the money. The state doesn't have the money. That is true. And the workers don't have the money. That is true. In this interview with Varoufakis, when he says we're going to fight tax evasion, and the interviewer says every government for the last 50 years has said every time there's a difficulty, we're not going to make the usual people pay. We're going to make we're going to tax evasion, and every government has promised, and it never happens. No, not with us. We're going to take it. Very good, very good. 20 billion has already left the banks. You've got to say, how are you going to stop that on a capitalist basis, respecting the laws of the European Union and of capitalism? They have a right to take the money out of the bank and put it where they want, which could be a Swiss bank account or a New York bank account or whatever. That's 20 billion, and that's nothing compared to what they've stashed away over decades. The Greek oligarchy, the Greek capitalist class, has more wealth than the total value of the Greek debt. Therefore, the logic would be, you've made this wealth on the backs of Greek working people. You have no right to it. Look at the way the banks behave. Look at the way the oligarchs behave. Nationalise the major corporations, not the small businesses, the major ones, and the banks. The only way you can control genuinely capital flows and all the rest of it is by nationalising the banks, making them into one Greek central state bank, and then you'll be able to control the capital and get your hands on the real wealth. Well, that means you have to pose the socialist alternative, which is precisely what Varoufakis in that text of his said we can't do. He says the left isn't ready. I would agree with him on that, but which left? I would agree that those comrades in the movement, whether it's in Syriza or it's in Podemos or whether it's in Mélenchon in France or left-wing Labour people, if those comrades have got to say concretely, what alternative do you have? So far, what they've said is, in the moment of crisis, we have to compromise with even the right-wing forces. We have to compromise and try and save capitalism because we're not ready. That's true. You're not ready precisely because you're not prepared to tell the workers the concrete truth, which is, if you want the Thessaloniki program, you must support us in nationalising the banks and the oligarchy's property. If we do that, the funds are there. If we don't do that, then it's any question will be, well, how are you going to pay for it? With this, with that, you've got to be within the budget. Got to be within the budget. So you're free to introduce a reform as long as you cut somewhere else an equal amount. So you can increase pensions, but you're going to have to cut on healthcare. That's the logic of the situation that they've placed themselves in. And the danger of this situation is that precisely what Comrade Varoufakis wants to avoid, which is a strengthening of the right, is what will eventually happen as a result of this behaviour. Because already Syriza itself is in conflict inside the party. There are divisions. Even Tsipras' majority is no longer one solid block of opinion. They had a meeting, a sort of ad hoc meeting. There was about 110 of the Syriza MPs present, and Tsipras wanted to test the ground to see the opinions. Something like 35 said they couldn't vote for this. Now that means you're already cracking Syriza. Instead of consolidating it and strengthening it, you're breaking it up internally. The left wing is in difficulty because Lafazanis made it clear, no further privatizations. Now he's been told, no, I'm sorry, that's no longer valid. He's going to have a problem how he's going to pose that to his own supporters in the party and to the wider electorate. And more than one commentator, I think even Peston, in the BBC, if I can find it, anyway, he says that one of the problems they've got is that how they're going to sell this to their own electorate. If I can find it, sorry. No, I can't find it. I'm going on memory. But that's it. In appeasing the European economic establishment, seen only days ago as the enemy, Mr. Varoufakis risks alienating his friends, the members and supporters of his very young party. The danger for him is that he buys economic and financial stability at the price of political instability. It's inevitable. We're in the early days here. But if this approach continues over a prolonged period of time, and even, let's put it this way, even this agreement, if it's applied, has only bought the government a few months, which is what they were asking for initially, a few months in which to negotiate. Now, we have seen in the last few weeks what you can get by negotiating with the European Union. Very, very little. The idea that we just take a little bit longer and we'll convince them is utopian. Those economic interests are very powerful, and they're not going to change and they're not going to be budged. There's also a good reason why. You see, when Comrade Varoufakis tries to explain to these people the dangers in their policy, he's right. He's right in what he's saying. He says, look, what you're doing is impossible. Basically, you're doing a Versailles, what they did to the Germans at Versailles. They demanded so much that they pushed Germany towards a revolutionary situation. And later, because the left in Germany at the period failed to give an alternative, eventually the rise of Hitler. That is there. The problem is, you see, if they make any concession to Greece of a significant nature, i.e. lifting the pressure, the Irish finance minister already said, you do this, we want the same treatment. The Spanish and Portuguese governments, reactionary governments, were amongst the hardest in the negotiating with Greece. You would think that Spain and Portugal would say, look, we want a bit of... No, it's because Rajoy knows you make concessions to the Greeks and Podemos will win the elections in Spain. That's the situation they're in. And Podemos are standing on an anti-austerity program. So it wouldn't be negotiating just with Varoufakis. You'd be negotiating with Pablo Iglesias. And the potential for anti-austerity parties. Martin Wolf, in an article in the Financial Times a few days ago, actually said the fragmentation of politics everywhere and anti-establishment parties everywhere. And they see it as a worrying development for the capitalists and finance capital, because they can see what's behind it, which is that people are reaching a limit to what they can take. Therefore, the way they've treated Greece is try and humiliate them and give the rest of Europe the example. You go down this road, this is how you'll end up. And I think there's a serious section of the German bourgeois in particular who are prepared to go all the way to a Grexit, i.e. an exit of Greece, because from a political point of view, see, if they leave the European Union and the Euro, that's not a magic solution either. On a capitalist basis, it's not a solution. That's why some on the left are wrong on this. We are against the European Union as Marxists, and we're against the Euro from what it stands for. But you can't pose it on a capitalist basis, say, out of the Euro, bring back the drachma. The drachma would be a currency that nobody would want. It would be devalued by at least 50%. And nobody would... Imagine a country that's reneged on all its debts and then goes to the banks and asks for credit. Well, you wouldn't get it. You'd have... it would be equally as bad, and therefore leaving you can't end with just the word leaving. It has to be connected to a transformation within Greece, which means taking the wealth and appealing to the workers of Europe. You know, at one point, one of the ministers of this government said, this struggle is not just a struggle of the Greek workers, it's a struggle of the European workers. And they were right. You can bet that workers all over Europe were looking to Greece, hoping for a model, for an example to follow. And that's why finance capital in Europe has to crush the Greek experience and send a message that all your utopian left ideas are all very good. When it comes to serious business, we decide what happens. Therefore, you have to connect it to the idea of a socialist transformation of Greece but also of Europe. And this may sound utopian, and it's not serious, it's not really realpolitik, it's not really looking at the real conditions. Very good. Let's put it this way. Unless we pose the socialist alternative, we have to compromise with these people. And compromise in a big way. And the next few months, in negotiations over the longer-term future of Greece, you will see massive pressure of finance capital. In reality, it's a class conflict on a European scale that's taking place. And it's utopian to think that you can find a solution within this system. And what the Greek experience is showing, in practice actually, is that you cannot defend the interests of Greek working people at the same time as maintaining the interests of European finance capital and the Greek oligarchy. The two don't go together. And it's a practical experience. And it could have disastrous consequences. We as Marxists would not be happy to see... there are some on the ultra-left who say, well, this is all good because Greece is going to collapse, Syriza is going to be crushed, and then the revolutionary left will emerge and take over. But history doesn't show... It's not that simple. Syriza could fragment a few years down the road, and not even too far down the road, because the pressure is immense to satisfy different class interests. And we've seen that before. We saw what happened to the PASOK in the past. This can happen again. Syriza could be a beacon for the workers of Europe, but we believe only if it is, as you say, fully consistent and consequential to its own program and goes all the way. If it stops halfway, then you have to start retreating. And if you keep retreating, at a certain point, you will start to get the blame. And the mood will change. It's already begun to change in Greece. It's not the same enthusiastic mood as a week ago or 10 days ago. It has changed very quickly. And the mood will start to develop, and you can bet the bourgeois media, the press, the TV, the idea they want to send the Greeks is Syriza, they're just the same as the others. They're the same political class which promises things and never keeps the promises and then carries out the opposite. If that mood starts to grip, then instead of weakening Golden Dawn, it will be strengthened on the far left. And other forces, which in this period could potentially be almost wiped off the political map, will emerge. And there'll be confusion. That's what will reign, not a clear-cut alternative on the left. That's why we as the Marxists in Syriza, or our comrades in Syriza, and in other countries where we work in the left, we work to win the working class and its parties to the program of Marxism. And our task, I think, is to patiently explain. At the beginning, when they formed a coalition with the independent Greeks, our comrades opposed that. It was very difficult to do because the idea was, what else can they do? Well, these negotiations show that Syriza had the potential to actually govern on its own if it wished, if it wanted to go that way. And there's criticisms. I mean, I've got sources here within Syriza itself, like Statis Kouvelakis of Syriza. Serious doubts. And he says, what's happening is putting into question the central idea that we had, which we could carry out the Saloniki program within the European Union and its logic. And the experience has shown that's not possible. That's an important conclusion. Question is, and therefore, where do we go from here? I have to conclude because I don't want to take the time. I want to give time people to intervene. The conclusion is, you have to say to the people what is and explain that you need to transform society. You need to take the wealth from where it is. And if you don't, that same wealth will be used against you in the media, economic sabotage. We've seen it in Venezuela at the moment. The right wing and the bourgeois are causing economic sabotage, shortages, etc., and blaming the government for it. They'll do that to Syriza. Any difficulty, which is a consequence of capitalism, not Syriza, but it will be blamed on the Syriza government. And a lot of people will say, yeah, they went into the government, and what did they do? And then, from this surge forward, the party could be facing difficulties. We're warning against that, and what we're saying is it's not too late. The party still can change, go back to its original program and insist on it, put it to the people. Unfortunately, Comrade Tsipras even has doubts about convening the Central Committee, which is an elected body of the party, because he's worried about the different opinions which are expressed there. It doesn't bode well, But we have to work to strengthen the Marxist position within the party and within the left as a whole, and to convince the party and the electorate of a need for to take another step forward, not a step back. I'll leave it there. Somebody asked the question of the role of the Kukwe. The Communist Party of Greece says many things which we would agree with, but the way it poses it is utterly sectarian. For example, if they had wanted to really push Syriza, they would have said publicly, we're prepared to vote in favour of anything we propose as a government in the interests of working people, which would have put the leadership of Syriza in a much more difficult position, i.e., they justify their coalition with ANEL, the independent Greeks, on the basis that they don't have a majority and that the communists don't support us, and therefore what else? And that created a mood. The overwhelming majority of Syriza supporters immediately after the elections were of the idea, well, what else can they do? Independent Greeks are against the memorandum, on that we can agree and form a coalition. The fact that they are right-wing New Democracy, that's their roots, that's where they come from, which would mean that if you talk about privatisation, healthcare, pensions, everything else, you wouldn't be able to agree with them. Just on the one anti-European thing. If the Kukwe had said that, it would have been a dialogue with the ranks of Syriza and would have opened up a dialogue. Instead, by their sectarian approach, they actually closed the doors. Like a sealed compartment between Kukwe and Syriza. They even said, the demonstrations that were in favour of Greece, they invited people in Europe not to go and demonstrate because Syriza is trying to save capitalism. This is all a manoeuvre. You've got to understand that, and therefore the people on the streets are not trying to save capitalism. They're fighting capitalism. Completely sectarian the way they proposed it. Even though if you actually read the content, a lot of what they say makes sense. But the way they do it and the way they divide the working class leaves them in an isolated corner, basically. We could talk more about that, but I don't have time. The question of tax collection, you see this idea. The question is this: the amount of taxes that you would have to collect from the Greek bourgeoisie is enormous. You have a 320 billion euro debt. You say they could collect 30 billion. Let's say they did. It would take a year. Yeah. It would take 10 years to collect the money. You've got to consider the interest on that. Therefore, it would take maybe 15 years. If you could collect 30 billion euros. And the question is this: under capitalism, it's not a question of efficiency of collection. The capitalist class has 1,001 ways of evading legally. We had the case recently of that Tory who said everybody's tax avoiding, which means you register a company somewhere else, your profits disappear from here and they appear somewhere else. The market is international, and the only way you can force them to pay is to take their wealth, take control of it. And to do that, you'd have to mobilize the Greek masses. The only way you can get them to pay their taxes is to actually grab them and force them, empty their pockets physically. They're not going to do that. In Cuba, in 1959, Castro came to power. And the multinational corporations in Cuba were paying no taxes. And Castro said, people don't remember, Castro was not a communist when he came to power. He was an orthodox, he was basically a bourgeois liberal, trying to carry out reforms in Cuba along the lines of America or Europe, i.e. taxing and reforming. And he imposed a tax on the companies, much lower than they were paying in the United States. But he had the intelligence to say, anybody who refuses to pay will be expropriated. They refused to pay, because 90% of them were American companies. And Castro was actually, on this, he was very consistent, coherent. He said, right, you're not paying, expropriated. That's what Syriza should do. You say to them, look, we don't want,
on a propaganda way, I don't want to take you over, I don't want to expropriate you. Just pay all the taxes you owe, and it's fine. But I'd say to them, if they don't, we're taking them up. You would have overwhelming support in Greece for a policy like that. Because in the interview with Varoufakis, the thing is, who's going to pay? Is it much easier to make a shopkeeper pay his taxes than a shipbuilder? Yeah. It's much easier to make a worker pay his taxes because he has to pay every single penny because he can't hide his income. But once you start to go into other sections of society, especially the further up, they have many ways of hiding their income. So it's not a question of simply more efficiency. It's a political question of the will to use the full force of the working class to do it. And if you're going to do that, why not go all the way and expropriate them anyway? Because I'm telling you, there is no bourgeoisie which will tolerate that level of taxation without organising against you. They will cause economic chaos, they will flight of capital, they will slash investment, and they will create a situation worse than it is now, and they'll blame you for it. Because people don't, when the economy goes well, whoever's in power, in Britain the last 60 years, if the Tories were in power when there was a boom, people would say, oh, it's good, we're living okay under the Tories. And if there was a boom under Labour, they say, oh, Labour are doing a good job, I remember, yeah. But if the economy goes bad, it doesn't matter who's in power, they blame who's in power. Because they're the government after all. And Syriza would get the blame. So you might as well go all the way. On the question of Tsipras counting on... I've spoken to, before Syriza was formed, Synaspismos activists. They had this idea of forming a sort of southern European, almost, coalition of countries against austerity. The question is this. Tsipras doesn't realise that by compromising on the negotiations, he's actually weakening Podemos. Because Podemos is strengthened if people think, if I vote for this party, I can actually achieve genuine change. And in this recent period, Podemos and Syriza have been linked, like Siamese twins almost, in the consciousness of European masses. And if Syriza backtracks and starts to internal fighting, Podemos, I think eventually Podemos probably will win because of the logic of Spain. But that struggle is weakened if you adopt that policy in Greece. It's not just waiting for Podemos to win. And what do you do until they win? You have to compromise your position, as they have done, and weaken your position inside Greece, and therefore weaken Podemos. The question of contagion. The bourgeois, before 2008, were very confident that everything was fine. Boom, the economy, everything's fantastic. Everything's fantastic until it becomes abominable and collapses. And in 2008 they had the crisis, which they weren't expecting. The idea that the contagion is ridiculous. The honest, serious bourgeois commentators, and I've read that in the Financial Times and other journals, they actually say, to be honest, we don't know what would happen if Greece left the European Union and the Euro, because we've never been there. But some of the serious ones are saying it would be the beginning of the unravelling of the European Union itself. Because it's ridiculous. You talk about the Greek debt, the Italian debt is over 2 trillion euros. And if Italy enters into a crisis like Greece, it's not 2% of GDP. Italy is the third economy of the Eurozone, after Germany and France. And if Italy goes into that crisis, and Italy, oh yeah, the insurance is, it's all right. You go to Italy, and you talk to the people in Italy, and then come and tell me if Italy is a stable, tranquil country. The tension, you can feel the tension everywhere in Italy. Let's not forget, a comedian stood in the elections in Italy and got 25%. Beppe Grillo, okay? He's a comedian. Some people say, well, we had a comedian before Berlusconi. But what it showed is that even there, unfortunately, Beppe Grillo is not anywhere near even as left as Syriza or Podemos, a bit of a populist, but there was nothing else. But a huge percentage of the Italian population voted for something which was seen as an anti-establishment party,
Now they're in a bit of difficulty because they also don't know what to really offer as a solution. Contagion is not just economic, it's also political. And that's what we've been seeing in Europe. On the question of the President of the Republic, well, you know, the President of the Republic of Greece is presented as having no powers, but he does have some powers. Who nominates the Prime Minister after the elections? It's the President, obviously on the basis of the election results. But if the first candidate fails within a few days, he has to offer the second. And he has certain powers in those situations. And you elect a president in a situation where all the speculation, the serious bourgeois are saying, we don't think Syria will last 12, 18 months in this situation. You know, there'll be a crisis, and a crisis of a government, and instability. And in that situation, who do you elect? A neoclassical politician. They probably thought that was a way of showing that we're all united and Greece is together, get it out of the way, and it's not a problem. But it can become a problem in a particular situation, so we would disagree with what they did that. On the question of GDP-linked bonds, what I'm saying is, if I buy a bond, I'm a capitalist. Even if I'm not a capitalist, I have 10,000 euros of savings, and I go to the bank, and usually what they do, they try and sell you some kind of bond, and they say, look, don't leave it in the bank because it only gives you 0.5%. Some of you must have been there. There's these bonds of this kind and that kind. You get 3% over, but you've got to block them for 5 years and this kind of thing. Now, even I, to be honest, if I had £10,000 of savings and they said to me, put them in Greek bonds, I would say, you must be crazy. My life savings, I don't have 10,000. If I had them, you know, my mother may have something like that. You know? But I said, Mother, don't buy Greek bonds. Don't buy Italian bonds either. In fact, don't buy bonds. Maybe German ones. Sure. German ones, you know why they buy them? Because if you buy German bonds, you actually end up losing money. But you're paying them for a safe bond, i.e. one that you know they'll pay back at the end of it. That's the condition we're in under capitalism. They're looking for where do I put my money where I can actually get it back? If I put it in Greek bonds, on the basis of GDP. Now the question is this. If Greece could achieve 5 or 10% growth in GDP over the next 10 or 20 years, and somebody could guarantee that, then I would buy Greek GDP-linked bonds. Because Greece would be able to pay. Because it's making real money. Now, if any serious economist believes that Greece can grow by 5 or 10% in the next 10, 15 or 20 years, it cannot. Even if it leaves Europe. First of all, if it leaves Europe, the markets would be closed compared to now. But that's not really a big problem because Greece can't export anyway. And the reason it can't export, apart from a few things, feta cheese maybe, even that, I bought feta cheese which is made in Germany. It is. By Greeks in Germany probably, but it's made in Germany. To make money on a capitalist basis, you have to sell goods. That's how you make a real profit. You know, they think that you make money by lending money and the real wealth is in the productive process, in making things. Coats, pens, paper, tables, cars, houses, food. The real wealth is there. You make it, you produce it, you sell it, you make a profit. You make enough profit, you can pay debts if you have debts. Now, the thing about Greece is that Greek industry is much behind in terms of productivity. The level of productivity of Greece, on average, is about 30% lower than Germany. Now, why is that? It's not because the Greek workers work less, or are weaker, or are more stupid, or less skilled. On the contrary, in actual hours, they work more. They work more. And they get paid a lot less than the German workers. But the German workers are more productive. The reason for that is the German bourgeoisie, over decades, since it recovered after the Second World War, have invested on a much higher level. And under capitalism, this is the problem. They think you cannot have capitalism on a global scale where all countries are equally rich, all producing and selling. Because if somebody sells, somebody else doesn't sell. And you can't, you see, the productive capacity of European industry as a whole is far bigger than the European market itself. And therefore, there's a limit to what you can sell. And if you can't sell enough, you don't make enough money. And if your productivity is lower, you sell even less. So even if there was no European Union, Greece will be in difficulty. To increase productivity by 30%, you have to massively invest in technology, modern, advanced technology. And even if you do that, you'd only be on a par with Germany, equal level. Now, because the Greek bourgeoisie, like any capitalist, says, well, listen a minute, I'm going to invest my wealth here. What are the prospects of Greece being able to sell and make sufficient profit for me to invest in it? They look at the situation and they say, pretty grim. The prospects are not there. I'm not investing. But there's another way of doing it. I can increase my competitiveness. How? By reducing the cost of labour. Now, no. That's what the governments in Greece have been doing. That's why the minimum wage is not 750, it's much lower. That's why you have jobs, 300-400 euros a month. You know, what, 1/5, 1/10 what it is in Germany. And yet it's still not competitive because of the backwardness of the industry. But the only logic is, if you're going to be competitive, you've got to reduce your cost of production. And to reduce your cost of production, the one element which is easiest to reduce is the human element, the cost of labour. So in or out of the European Union, a capitalist Greece would face that situation. And there's no way out of that on a capitalist basis. Under capitalism, you make a profit by selling. To sell, you've got to be competitive. To be competitive, you've got to produce good quality goods more cheaply than your competitors. That means you've got to have a high-tech input and you've got to have labour at a certain cost. If your high-tech input is big, you can actually pay the workers more and they still remain competitive and more productive because they produce far more in the amount of time they work. This is basic Marxist economics, which Varoufakis claims to know. That he's read it. Well, look, he's read it, but he doesn't apply it. The question about Yanis Varoufakis, you know, he's not a member of Syriza. You know that, don't you? He's not a member, but he's a minister. He actually says, in the interview, he says, since the initial pledge of Syriza was that the 2015 incomes would have the tax-free of the 12,000 euros, i.e. one of the other demands was that anybody earning below 12,000 euros a year would not pay tax, i.e. basically the personal allowance is lifted. And that's not going to be applied either. And he says, this is Varoufakis, the Minister of Finance is a member of the government, but he is not a member of Syriza. On the question of who decides, here we have a minister who's not even a member of the party, just an economist. And prior to being a minister for Syriza, he was an advisor to Papandreou. He says it. He said he came back to Greece in the year 2000, and he says, I threw my lot in with George Papandreou, hoping to help stem the return to power of resurgence. He's been there before. He has been there before as an advisor. So he wasn't directly responsible. And then he says that as he disagreed with the way they were dealing with the crisis, he resigned as an advisor in 2006. The way he's tried to do is apply the same ideas. So he hasn't even got the direct accountability to the party on this. And this is quite a common thing in many European left parties. When they form a government, they try and get the experts from here and there. But you've got to look at the policy that he defends. On the question of German gold, well, they can try to get it back. They haven't even managed to get the marbles from the Parthenon from Britain. Imagine if they can get the gold from Germany. It's not a question of right or morality. It's a question of power. Do they have the power to do so? No, they don't, because they signed agreements, and it's dubious to go that far back to say, well, you took this and you owe us this and you owe us that. They can try, but the Germans will say, well, you want to go down that road? It's fine. But we are the European Central Bank. Your banks need how many billions a week? Well, try, and then we'll see. You do that, we'll pull the plug here, and there'll be a collapse of the economy. It isn't that simple. That's been raised, that's been thrown in as a little thing there, but it's actually inconsequential. The question is this. This is a crisis of capitalism on a global scale. And it's not simply about Greece and the crisis in Greece. You know, there's a lot of talk about the Greek situation, but I'm amazed when I walk around Bethnal Green, the number of young Italians I see with suitcases. I think, Italian, Italian, Italian. You talk to them, and I've spoken to people from Milan, working in bars in London, and I said, Milanese emigrating? Milanese never used to emigrate. Milan was the place everybody else emigrated to in Italy. Now they're leaving, because the situation is dire. There is no work. And the prices of housing has collapsed. People can't even sell their houses. I was talking to a guy yesterday who's, after 22 years, he's an Algerian who emigrated to Italy 22 years ago, and now he's jobless, and he wants to sell a house, and they've offered him 2/3 of what he paid for it, and he can't sell it. This is Italy. Contagion is definitely there, not only economically, but politically it's there, because the workers of Italy, of Spain, and Portugal, and other countries are looking to Greece. And that's why what Tsipras and the Syriza government do is not merely a short-term question. It's a question of the future of Greece and the prospects for Europe as a whole, i.e., is it possible for a left government to change society in such a way that we can have education, we can have healthcare, we can have jobs, and we can have decent pensions? That's all. You know, they talk about extremism. I don't consider myself an extremist. I'm a Marxist. Yes, I think that the only way to solve things is to overthrow capitalism. But the reason I think that is because I want an education for my kids, a good education, not Oxford necessarily, not Eton, but a good education. I want to be able to have a doctor when my kids are ill, when I'm ill. I want an ambulance that turns up when I call it, and not makes me wait for 6 hours or 12 hours, and possibly you die as a result, which is what is happening here in Britain. Yeah. Decent housing and a job. I don't want to work 10 hours a day. I want to work 7, 8 maybe. And a reasonable. That's not extreme. That's quite a reasonable request, which is actually what the Greek people voted for by voting for Syriza. But will they get it? We argue that unless you break with capitalism, they're not going to get it. And the danger in that is this: the enormous enthusiasm, the enormously favourable situation for the left can be thrown away over a period of time, and then the capitalists will, you can bet your bottom dollar, the bourgeois media will be banging away about the unreasonable requests of Tsipras, these lefts who don't know how to run things. They can talk when they're the opposition, but when they have to run things, they're no good. We need serious people. That will be the propaganda, and they will weaken electorally the party, and then you'll have a continuation of the instability on a political level, and then the danger of the right wing emerging is there. Why did they rise? Because the left is not offering an alternative, and therefore they offer an alternative. Their alternative is quite easy: leave the euro, leave the European Union, and basically build a massive wall around Greece, and then we'll get on with that. You know, the Nazis, the Greek Nazis. That's what they. That also would be a complete failure. And the only way you could do that is by imposing a dictatorship. And the problem with that is that the Greek workers are not too keen on dictatorship, as far as I'm aware. So this is a discussion not just about the immediate situation in Greece, as I said, but about the general crisis of capitalism on a global scale. It's not just Greece; the whole world is deeply enmeshed in crisis. It's this crisis explains the conflict in the Ukraine, which is fundamentally a conflict between Russia on the one hand and Germany and the West on the other, over a market, which is the Ukrainian market, which is 50 million people, after all, and spheres of influence and power. Because of the market is limited, within it, the only way you can increase your market is at the expense of somebody else's. And that, at a certain point, leads even to military conflicts like in the Ukraine, which is in Europe. And it's happening also more on further out. You know, all this talk about IS in the Middle East and the Islamic fundamentalists. If you read what's behind it, they're doing very good business, by the way. They're doing excellent business. They're making big money. It's another form, it's another way of making money, what they're doing out there. They've got their hands on the oil now, and they've created their own little state. And they're enriching themselves at the expense of people. This is what's happening on a global scale. It's an indication of the deep crisis of capitalism on a global scale. And unless the left offers an alternative, then the barbarism which Varoufakis insists upon will become a reality. And in fact, what I just referred to, Ukraine, ISIS, is creeping barbarism on a global scale. And it's not going to stop unless the working class intervenes and changes society. I have a lot more I could say, but I think I'll leave it there.